Welcome to this video of 3 sci-fi short stories. I'll be narrating a delightful story called Picture Bride by William Morrison, aka Joseph Samachson, then a modern release by Haldane B. Doyle, The Final Bookshop, and finally we'll enjoy The Doorway by Evelyn E. Smith. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Picture Bride by William Morrison, also known as Joseph Samachson. Narrated by William Skye. As pretty as a picture? Yes, because that was all she was, or would become someday. My brother Perry always was a bit cracked. As a kid, he almost blew up our house doing experiments. When he was 18, he wrote poetry, but fortunately that didn't last long, and he went back to science. Now, when he showed me this picture, I figured he'd had a relapse of some kind. "This is the girl I'm in love with," he said. She wasn't bad, not bad at all, even if her clothes were crazy. She wasn't my type, too brainy looking, although I could see how some guys would go for her. "I thought you liked blondes." "I wouldn't give you 2 cents for all the blondes in Hollywood," he answered. "This is the only girl for me." "You sound as if you've got it bad," I said. "You going to marry her?" His face dropped about a mile. "I can't." "You mean she's married already?" I was surprised. This wasn't like Perry at all. He sort of hesitated, as if he was afraid of saying too much. "No, she isn't married. I asked her about that. But I can't marry her because, well, I've never met her. All I've seen of her is this picture and a few more. She doesn't live here." "You mean she's in Europe?" "I've heard of these love affairs by mail, and they never made much sense to me." I said to Perry, "Why can't she come to this country?" "Oh, there are lots of things in the way." It sounded worse and worse. I said, "Look, Perry, this smells like a racket to me. It's the kind of thing a couple of shrewd operators cook up to take some hick for a ride. I'm surprised at you falling for it. How do you know that there really is a dame like that in Europe? Anybody can send pictures." "You've got it all wrong," he said. "I've spoken to her." "By phone? How do you know who's on the other end? You hear a dame's voice you never heard before. What makes you think it's hers?" Again, he didn't seem to want to talk, as if he had some secret to hide. But I guess he felt like getting things off his chest too, or he wouldn't have opened up in the first place. And he had already told me enough so that if he didn't tell me more, he'd sound like a dope. So after hesitating even longer than before, he said, "Let's get this straight, George. This is no racket. I've seen and talked to her at the same time, and the things she talked about, no con man would know." "You've seen and talked to her at the same time? You mean by TV?" "I don't believe it. They can't send TV to Europe." "I didn't say it was TV, and I didn't say she lived in Europe." "That's exactly what you did say. Or maybe you meant she lived on Mars?" "No, she's an American." "This makes less and less sense to me. Where did you meet her?" He turned red and squirmed all over the place. Finally he said, "Right here in my own laboratory." "In your own laboratory? But you said that you never met her in the flesh." "I didn't. Not really by TV either. The fact is, she isn't born yet." I backed away from him. When he was a kid and blew up our kitchen, I didn't like it. When he wrote poetry, I was kind of ashamed and didn't want my pals to know he was my brother. Now I was really scared. Everything he had been saying in the last 10 minutes began to make sense, but a screwy kind of sense. He saw how I felt. "Don't worry, George, I haven't gone crazy. Her time is 2973, more than 1,000 years from now. The only way I've seen and talked to her is on a time contact machine." "Come again?" "A kind of time machine. It can't send material objects back and forth across time, as far as I know, but it can send certain waves, especially the kind we use to transmit signals. That's how she and I could talk to each other and see each other." "Perry, I think you ought to see a good doctor." "It's a remarkable device," he said, paying no attention to how I was trying to help him. "She's the one who first constructed it and contacted me. It's based on an extension of Einstein's equations." "You think you can explain so much?" I said. "Okay then, explain this. This dame isn't going to be born for 1,000 years, and yet you tell me you're in love with her. What's the difference between you and somebody that's nuts? I asked, as if anybody knew the answer. He certainly didn't. In fact, he went ahead and proved to me that they were the same thing, because for the next couple of weeks the only thing he'd talk about, outside of equations I couldn't understand, was this dame. How smart she was, and how beautiful she was, and how wonderful she was in every way that a dame can be wonderful, and how she loved him. For a time he had me convinced that she actually existed. Compared with you, I said, Romeo had a mild case. There are some quantities so great that you can't measure them, he said. That will give you some idea of our love for each other. There it went, the old poetry, cropping out in him just like before. And all the time I'd been thinking it was like measles, something that you get once and it builds up your resistance so you don't get it again, at least not bad. It just goes to show how wrong I could be. What preacher are you going to get to marry you? I asked. A guy born 500 years from now? I don't think that's funny, he said. You're telling me. Look, Perry, you're smart enough to know what I'm thinking. You still think I'm crazy? I got an open mind on the subject. Now, if you won't see a doctor, then how about letting me take a look at this dame so I can convince myself? No, he said. I've considered doing that and decided against it. Her voice and image come through for only about 5 minutes a day, sometimes less. And those minutes are very precious to us. We don't want anyone else present, anyone at all. Not even to convince me she actually exists? You wouldn't be convinced anyway, he said very shrewdly. No matter what I showed you, you'd still find a reason to call it a fraud. He was right at that. It would take a lot of convincing to make me believe that a babe who wasn't going to get born for 1,000 years was in love with him. By this time, though, I was sure of one thing. There was something screwy going on in that laboratory of his. For 5 minutes a day he was watching some dame's picture, listening to her voice. If I had an idea what she was like, I might figure out where to go from there. I began keeping an eye on Perry, dropping in at the laboratory to pay him visits. There was what looked like a 10-inch TV tube in one corner of his place, not housed in a cabinet but lying on the table among dozens of other tubes and rheostats and meters and other things I didn't know about. Along the wall that led from this corner was a lot of stuff which Perry said was high voltage and warned me not to touch. I kept away. I wasn't trying to figure out how to get myself killed. All I wanted to know was when he saw this girl. Finally, I managed to pin the time down to between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. For 5 minutes every day during that hour, he locked the door and didn't answer phone calls. I figured that if I dropped in, then I might get a glimpse of her. And that's what I did. At first, when I knocked on the door, there was no answer. In a minute, though, I heard Perry's voice, but he wasn't talking to me. He was saying, "Darling," and he sounded kind of sick, which I figured was due to love. Come to think of it, he might have been scared a little. I heard him say, "Don't be afraid," and it was quiet for about 15 seconds. Then I heard a terrific crash, like lightning striking. The door shook, and I smelled something sharp, and the first thing I wanted to do was get out of that place. But I couldn't leave my brother in there. I put my shoulder to the door and had no trouble at all. The explosion, or whatever it was, must have weakened the hinges. As the door crashed in, I looked for Perry. There was no sign of him. But I could see his shoes on the floor in front of that TV tube where he must have been standing. No feet in them, though, just his socks. All the high-voltage stuff was smoking. The TV screen was all lit up, and on it I could see a girl's face, the same girl whose picture Perry had shown me. She was wearing one of those funny costumes, and she looked scared. It was a clear picture, and I could even see the way she gulped. Then she broke out into a happy smile, and for about half a second before the second explosion, I could see Perry on the screen. After that second explosion, even though it wasn't near as big as the first, that TV set was nothing but a mess of twisted junk, and there was no screen left to see anything on. Perry liked to have everything just so, and he'd never think of going any place without his tie being knotted just right and his socks matching, and so on. and here he travelled 1,000 years into the future in bare feet. I felt kind of embarrassed for him. Anyway, they were engaged, and now they must be married, so I guess she had slippers waiting for him. I'm just sorry I missed the wedding. The Final Bookshop by Haldane B. Doyle. Narrated by William Skye. To write in the year 2028 is, to put it mildly, a nerve-raising proposition. Or should I have said hair-racking? Don't you dare lecture me about the muddled clichés. But seriously, what else does a live human have to offer an audience anymore? My only remaining weapon is a malicious, desperate form of creativity. Anything less will no longer suffice. You see, perfection, at least as we previously understood it, has been captured in all its glory, trapped in amber and silicon, suffocated in corsets and algorithms. Any questions of beauty, profundity, and worst of all, marketability, they have all been solved, permanently and forever. I should have stayed home, tapping at my greasy keyboard tucked behind my disconnected terminal, losing track of my pot of ginger tea turning tepid. But curiosity got the better of me. So I changed my outfit to some form-fitting viscose activewear that even the most lumpenly wore without pause for reflection, and made my way to the auto-auteur that opened last month in the heart of my third-tier city. Approaching the gleaming robotic door, I tried to be grateful for the legislation that had banned mass production of the AI-generated works. The interior tingled with artificial leather and ozone, the air itself unmoving. Every surface gleamed with polished black glass. A holographic touchscreen of leather-clad tomes lined the walls. The illusion faltered at certain angles, a skew-whiff skeuomorph. A coiffed attendant escorted me to my booth. Her uniform, crisp and librarian-esque, asserted her intellectuality, but her porcelain eyes confessed a certain lack of inner life. Not a reader. Only there to smile and squeegee fingerprints off the walls. Once departed, she locked the door to my booth without once making eye contact. A flickering interface projected, accompanied by a condescending synthetic voice. "What story would you like today?" I knew what I really wanted to see, but couldn't bear the possibility of truth. Rather than give it the outline of my current novel, I racked my hair to challenge the damnable machine. Write me a romance about a time-travelling 15th century nun who falls in love with a genetically modified sentient walrus, in the style of Finnegan's Wake. That should tangle its transistors. A panel in the wall opened, and a velvet beanbag emerged, freshly steam-sterilized. I sank down, smug with my impossible challenge. A fresh pot of ginger tea emerged from another hole. The system must have tapped my consumer preferences via some mega database. After some minutes, I grew impatient. The contraption could have at least simulated a sequence of clunking and grinding noises to give the illusion of industry. Perhaps my outlandish request had thrown a carburettor in its cogs. Sitting there, my friend's confessions of life-changing reading experiences seemed implausible. A machine could never know the depths of the human heart. A panel in the ceiling opened. A pristine, leather-bound book slowly lowered into my lap, suspended by a golden thread. I untangled the hefty tome from its binding, the loose knots too perfect to be man-made. Hildegard's Garden. A serviceable title. Memorable without trying too hard. A cool, smooth stone to rock upon the tongue. I took a deep breath and a steaming, energizing sip, then sank back to read the day away. The opening hook was nothing flashy, but it got under my skin, and that unnerved me. Hildegard's longing echoed something in my own past, from a time I thought I had forgotten. Her life was upturned in ways that echoed my own fretful adolescence. She fought all the fights I had been too afraid to tackle, then won the rewards I barely allowed myself to dream of ever claiming. The style was crisp but calm, the tone frantic but never frenetic, the prose prepossessing but never imposing. All thoughts of proving this, that, or the other evaporated. The tale carried me to every corner of my mind, squeezed deep into every crevice of my heart. Part of me cursed as the stack of unread pages eroded between my fingertips. I wanted to tarry, to linger among the dales of exquisite exposition, but the plot drove me ever onwards. Hildegard achieved her dearest dream. And on that day, I forever lost mine. For a long time I sat afterwards, the book pressed shut between my trembling palms. In a long and lazy afternoon, I had lived 2 entire intertwined lives far richer and realer than my own. I was free to read it as many times as I wished, sustained by whatever delectables I summoned through the polished walls. I could not begin again. To do so would further savage my heart. I could not leave, not yet, not when I knew the price demanded to open that seamless glass door. In my lap sat the very thing I had reached toward my whole life: profundity, beauty, marketability even. This infernal machine could make as many more as I could request, each for the low price of 980 standard credits and another layer of insulation around my soul. This machine-made story had touched me deeply, changed me forever. Yet I could not reproduce its primal power once I left. Like waking from a dream, only the purest feeling remained within me. The diabolical mechanism was locked inside the book, and the book was locked inside this room. To protect the outside world from its power. Supposedly to protect pathetic human writers like myself, though in reality the auteur companies had lobbied to monopolize a sustainable revenue stream for themselves. I drained the bitter dregs from my cold teacup. Always best to get one's money's worth. When I stood, a new panel opened in the wall, a roaring fire within. I took a final moment to trace the ornate lettering on the cover. The power of writing had been a mere trick all along. A brittle spell. Nothing of consequence. A despicable trick of the light. I slipped the greatest story I had ever read into the flames, arranged my smile for the benefit of strangers, and stepped through the silent door, back into my ordinary life. If you enjoyed this story by Haldane B. Doyle, be sure to check out his recently released series of novellas. I can personally attest that they're well worth a read, with a fresh take on the biotechnological future of humanity. A link to the Amazon listing of the first in the series is in the description. The Doorway by Evelyn E. Smith. Narrated by William Skye. A man may wish he'd married his first love and not really mean it, but an insincere wish may turn ugly in dimensions unknown. It is my theory, Professor Falabella said, helping himself to a cookie, that no one ever really makes a decision. What really happens is that whenever alternative courses of action are called for, the individuality splits up and continues on 2 or more divergent planes, very much like the parthenogenesis of a unicellular animal. Delicious cookies, these, Mrs. Hughes. Thank you, Professor, Gloria simpered. I made them myself. You must give us the recipe, said one of the ladies, and the others murmured agreement, glad to get their individualities on a plane they could understand. Since most decisions are hardly as momentous as the individual imagines, Professor Falabella continued, and since the imagination of the average individual is very limited, many of these different planes, or as they are colloquially known, space-time continuums, may exist in close, even tangential relationship. Gloria rose unobtrusively and took the teapot to the kitchen for a refill. Her husband stood by the sink moodily drinking whiskey out of the bottle so as to avoid having to wash a glass afterward.
Bill, you're not being polite to our guests. Why don't you go out and listen to Professor Falabella?
I can hear him perfectly well from here, Bill muttered, and indeed the professor's mellifluous tones pervaded every nook and cranny of the thin-walled house. Long-winded cultist. What is he a professor of, I'd like to know?
Professor Falabella is not a cultist, affirmed Gloria angrily. He's a great philosopher.
Bill Hughes said something unprintable. If I'd married Lucy Allison, he continued unkindly, she'd never have filled the house with long-haired cultists on my so-called day of rest. Gloria's soft chin trembled and her blue eyes filled with tears. She was beginning to put on weight, he noticed.
I've been hearing nothing but Lucy Allison, Lucy Allison, Lucy Allison for the past year. You said yourself she looked like a horse.
Horses, he observed, have sense. He was being brutal, but he couldn't help it, and didn't want to. Professor Falabella was only the most long-winded of a long series of mystics Gloria was forever dragging into the house. The trouble with the half-educated, he thought bitterly, is that they seek culture in the most peculiar places. I'll bet she would have let me have peace on Sunday, he said. It just goes to show what happens when you marry a woman solely for her looks. He drained the bottle, then hurled it into the garbage pail with a resounding crash. Gloria's shoulders shook as she filled the kettle.
I wish I'd decided to be an old maid, she sobbed.
A very unlikely possibility, he thought. Even now, shop-worn as she was, Gloria could have a fairly wide range of suitors should something happen to him. She looked sexy, but how deceiving appearances could be. Professor Falabella was still talking as Bill and Gloria emerged from the kitchen. I believe that it is possible for an individual who exists on a limited plane of imagination to transpose from one plane to an adjacent one without difficulty. Great heavens, what was that? Something had whisked past the archway leading into the foyer.
Don't pay any attention, Gloria smiled nervously. The house is haunted. My dear, one of the ladies offered, I know of the most marvellous exterminator. The house, Gloria assured her coldly, really is haunted. We've been seeing things ever since we moved in.
And she really believed it, Bill thought. Believed that the house was haunted, that is. Of course he had seen things too, but he was enlightened enough to know that ghosts don't exist, even if you do see them. Professor Falabella cleared his throat. As I was saying, it is possible to send the individual through another, dimension as some popular writers would have it, to one of his other spatial existences on the same temporal plane. It is merely necessary for him to find the door. Nonsense, Bill interrupted. Wholly unmitigated nonsense. Every head swiveled to look at him. Gloria restrained tears with an effort. Brute, someone muttered, but ridicule apparently only stimulated the professor. He beamed. You don't believe me? Your imagination cannot extend to the comprehension of the multifariousness of space. Nonsense, Bill said again, but less confidently. I believe that I have discovered the doorway, Professor Falabella continued, and the way is open. However, most people fear to penetrate the unknown, even though it is to enter another phase of their own existence. I do admit that the shock of spatial transference, no matter how slight, combined with the concrete awareness of a previous spatial relationship, would be perhaps too much for the keenly sensitive individualism. Bill opened his mouth. I know what you're about to say, young man. You don't have to be a mind reader to know that, Bill assured him. His consonants were already a little slurred, and he knew Gloria was ashamed of him. It served her right. He'd been ashamed of her for years. Professor Falabella smiled. His teeth were very sharp and white. Very well, Mr. Hughes. Since you are a skeptic, perhaps you will not object to being the subject of our experiment yourself. What kind of an experiment? Bill asked suspiciously. Merely to go through the door. Any door can become the doorway if it is transposed into the proper spatial dimension. That door, for instance. Professor Falabella waved his hand toward the doorway of what Gloria liked to call Bill's study. You mean you just want me to open the door and go into that room? Bill asked incredulously. That's all? That is all. Of course, you go with the awareness that it is the threshold of another plane, and that you step voluntarily from this existence to an adjacent one. Sure, Bill said. He had just remembered there was a nearly full bottle of Calvert in the bottom drawer of the desk. Sure, anything to oblige. Very well. Go to the door, and keep remembering that of your own free will you are passing from this plane to the next. Look out, everybody, Bill called raucously as he pulled open the door. I'm coming in on the next plane. No one laughed. He stepped over the threshold, shutting the door firmly behind him. A wonderful excuse to get away from those blasted women. He'd climb out of the window as soon as he'd collected the whiskey and give them a nervous moment thinking he'd really passed into another existence. It would serve Gloria right. For a moment, as he crossed, he had a queer sensation. Maybe there was something in what Professor Falabella said. But no, there he was in the study. All that mumbo-jumbo was getting him down, that was all. He was a nervous man, only nobody appreciated the fact. Taking a cigarette out of the pack in his pocket, he reached for the lighter on his desk. It wasn't there. Time and time again he'd told Gloria not to touch his things, and always she'd disobeyed him. Company was coming, and she must tidy up. Cooking and cleaning, that was all she was good for. But this was carrying tidiness too far. She'd even removed the ashtrays. And where did that glass block paperweight come from? He'd had a penguin in a snowstorm, and he'd been happy with it. This was too much. He'd tell Gloria off. Stealing a man's penguin. He opened the door into the living room and bumped into Lucy Allison. Don't you think you've been in there long enough, Bill? She asked acridly. I'm sure your guests would appreciate catching a glimpse of you. Why, hello, Lucy, he said, surprised. I didn't know Gloria had invited you. Gloria, 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 Lucy cut across his sentence. You've been talking about nothing but that dumb little blonde for months. Because of the people in the room beyond, her voice was pitched low, but her pale eyes glittered unpleasantly behind her spectacles. I wish you had married her. You'd have made a fine pair. Gently, caressingly, the short hairs on the back of Bill's neck rose. Come back in here, Lucy said, hauling him back into the living room, where a number of people who had been enjoying the domestic fracas suddenly broke into loud and animated chatter. Dr. Hildebrand was telling us all about nuclear fission. Can't find an ashtray, Bill muttered, seizing on something tangible. Can't find an ashtray in the whole darned place. We've been over this millions of times, Bill. You know, she smiled at the guests, a smile that carefully excluded Bill. I'm allergic to smoke, but I never can get my husband to remember he isn't to smoke inside the house. Now, take the neutron, for example, Dr. Hildebrand said through a mouthful of pâté. What is the neutron? It is only... What was that? The wraith of Gloria crossed the foyer and disappeared. Bill took a step forward, then stood still. Lucy smiled self-consciously. That's nothing at all. The house is merely haunted. Everyone laughed. Forgot something, Bill muttered and dashed back into the study. He yanked open the bottom drawer of the desk. Sure enough, there was a bottle of Shenley, nearly a third full. There are some advantages, he thought as he tilted it to his lips, in having a limited imagination. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the stories, hit the like button and subscribe for more read-alongs every Monday and Friday. For more quick stories, I have another compilation like this one, featuring 4 rapid-fire stories from the likes of Philip K. Dick and Lester Del Rey. A link to that video is on screen now.